Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm William Murdoch. I'm the Executive Director of the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission. Our friends just call us MorPSC. We are really looking forward to a wonderful conversation today with our speakers from around the region and around the country at the Central Ohio Transportation Safety Forum. This is something that is our second annual, and we hope to keep doing this. Last year's event was quite an event, a way to lift up something that's so important to all of us as professionals and as residents in our community. So as the Regional Council for Central Ohio, MorPSC takes this really seriously. All things transportation are things that we focus on, but nothing's more important to transportation than keeping people safe when they're traveling Central Ohio's roads. Over 2 million people call Central Ohio home today. By 2050, that number is going to be upwards of 3 million. If you just saw the census numbers, it validated that. We added another 250,000 people just in the last 10 years. That means our roads are supporting more people every day. And these folks aren't just traveling in cars. Our transportation network supports people using every mode: trucks, buses, bikes, scooter, walking. And our team and all of you are working on designing a transportation network that accommodates all of these different users, and it's not easy work. It also means we have to sometimes make difficult decisions and trade-offs. And our communities here in Central Ohio are trying to meet this challenge every year. But even so, fatal and serious crashes, often involving our most vulnerable community members, are continuing in our region, and it continues to be a difficult issue for us. So last year at the Safety Forum, we shared a really important statistic and a very sobering one. Every year, about 100 individuals lose their lives in crashes on Central Ohio's roadways, and another 800 people suffer serious life-changing injuries. Just think about that. Think of if you knew 100 people at your church or in your community or your school or your workplace. That's how many people we lost on our roadways. Unfortunately, 2020 was something that was a lot more poignant for us. 2020 was different for so many reasons, but that didn't change. In fact, safety on our transportation system got worse. This happened throughout the country, even as traffic volumes on the roadways were significantly decreased because of the pandemic. Fatalities and serious injuries went up, and in Central Ohio, that means in 2020 alone, we lost about 150 people. That's the highest number of roadway fatalities we've seen on record in Central Ohio. And it means we have much more work to do. There is urgency around this. So we know that transportation safety looks a little different depending on which community that you're in. But I think I speak for all of us that we share a common vision. We want no fatalities. We want no serious injuries. There's no one-size-fits-all solution to accomplish this. And I think this is why it's so important to have events like this, because it really takes a lot of different people at that table. No single entity or agency or mayor or transportation planner can address all of this at once. We have to look at the entire system, what our team calls all of the E's of safety: engineering, enforcement, education, encouragement, evaluation, equity, emergency response. All of these things need to come into the equation to solve for safety. And that's why we brought you all here today. This is really serious, important work, and quite frankly, it's life-changing if we do it right. And that's why we're hopeful that you're here with your thoughts, your tough questions, your ideas, and we're really looking forward to some really thought-provoking discussions about what's happening in Central Ohio, in other parts of Ohio, and across the country. And you've seen the agenda, that's why you're here. We've got a really great panel and agenda for you today, including some national experts you're going to hear from really soon. And we're going to make sure to have time for Q&A so that you've got a chance to ask questions and also get into discussions with each other about transportation safety in your communities. Before I go any further, I just want to thank my team at MorPSC, Lauren and Amanda and everybody who's worked on this. This is something we take really personally. I have expert professionals in these individuals, and we owe them our thanks for keeping the spotlight on this, doing good work, and having an event like we have today. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to invite someone who is known nationally for safety and a leader in our state and our community and a great friend to our team at MorPSC, and that's Michelle May from the Ohio Department of Transportation. If you don't know, Michelle's been a member of ODOT for more than 30 years in communications and management roles. For the last 15 years, she's managed ODOT's $158 million highway safety program. This is that program that provides us all technical expertise and funding to prevent severe crashes. She also manages a statewide coalition of organizations focused on reducing traffic deaths and serious injuries, and a leader on issues like distracted driving, speeding, pedestrian and young driver safety. Michelle, I could go on, but we're really excited to have you as a partner and a friend and a leader, and I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks, everybody.
As I am lucky to have you all as well. You know, your program is only as successful as the people that you work with, and we work with the best, so thank you. Also wanted to thank Lauren again. Lauren put everything that you see here today, she organized and put together, and I think she's done a fabulous job, and I think you're really going to enjoy the speakers today. So before we get into the panel discussion, which really kicks off everything, Lauren and I wanted to give you a brief overview of what's happening in terms of transportation safety, both at the state level and then at the regional level. And so we have just a couple slides. Lauren, did I get that right? We are doing slides, right? Yep, there we are. So I just wanted to share with you all just a couple data points. Couple data points that I think are important for the discussion here today. So this shows you, it's a chart of traffic deaths going all the way back to 1936 when we first began keeping these types of records in the state of Ohio. And for decades, traffic deaths were going down. Safest year in Ohio history was in 2013 when we dropped below 1,000 traffic deaths for the first time since 1936. But since then, traffic deaths have been going up, and they've gone up every single year except for 2018. And so as I stand here today, we've seen 6 out of 7 years of rising traffic deaths. What's probably the most alarming is that we saw a rise in traffic deaths last year despite a 10 to 15% reduction in vehicle miles traveled in our state. So last year we had about 1,230 deaths, despite the fact that our vehicles are also getting so much safer. So we're clearly trending in the wrong direction. Next slide there, Lauren. Because we're going to talk about equity today, I just wanted to note this data point. So when we looked at fatalities and serious injuries between 2017 and 2019, what we found is that if you live in a community with a poverty rate at or above 10%, you were 10% more likely to have serious injuries and deaths. Next slide. This disparity is even more acute when you look at pedestrian-related deaths. So like many states across the nation, Ohio's been experiencing about a 10-year rise in pedestrian-related fatalities, as you can see on this chart. Next slide. But again, some communities feel it more acutely. So when we looked at pedestrian-related serious injuries and deaths between 2017 and 2019, we found that there were 102% more serious injuries and deaths involving pedestrians in communities with a poverty rate at or above 10%. So we feel very strongly at the Department of Transportation, as I know MorPSC does, that it's incumbent upon us to get more resources to those communities who need it the most. Next slide. And then before I turn it over to Lauren to talk about some of the regional stats that are important for us to understand today, I wanted to show you just when you combine fatalities and serious injuries in the state of Ohio, and this data is 2016 through 2020, you can see at the very top, you can see at the very top the most prominent cause or the most prevalent cause of fatalities and serious injuries in our state are roadway departure crashes, followed by intersection-related crashes. Then young drivers between the ages of 15 and 25, they're overrepresented, and they're overrepresented in serious injuries as well. Seatbelts, we've been hovering at around 85% seatbelt use in our state. We are a secondary state in terms of enforcement of seatbelt laws, so we have a lower rate of use. Older drivers, that's an area where we're seeing a rise in fatalities and serious injuries because we're aging as a nation and as a state. Alcohol, and then you go further down and you'll see distracted driving. But I will tell you that the data we have for distracted driving is woefully inadequate. I don't know what the true number is. I know it's low. And I suspect distracted driving is playing an increasing role. And we worry about, with every year, that people become more acclimated, more addicted, if you will, in some cases, to electronic devices, that they're becoming accustomed to using them behind the wheel. And we think that's a major contributor to the rise in traffic deaths within our state. And we're working on modernizing our laws. And hopefully some of you on this call are supporting those efforts. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lauren. And Lauren, you can talk about the regional outlook.
All right, great. Thank you, Michelle. Thanks for setting the stage for us and for joining us today for the forum. And I appreciate all the kind compliments. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lauren Cardoni. I am a senior planner at the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, and I work primarily in our active transportation and transportation safety planning. So it's good to have you all here with us again today to talk about transportation safety. So as Michelle mentioned, I'm going to give a quick rundown on the high-level trends that we've been seeing in the region. But first, I wanted to give a brief refresher on MorPSC's safety program. So MorPSC has been a partner in transportation safety efforts throughout the region since about 2005, when our regional safety program was first established. Historically, our funding for this program has kept us pretty focused on the areas within our Metropolitan Planning Organization, or the MPO area, as we like to call it. So that's what you see here in the green. And the data points that we are going to highlight for you today are specific to that MPO area. But we also provide services to members of our Central Ohio Rural Planning Organization, or CORPO, upon request. So through MorPSC's safety program, we participate in local and state safety committees, including ODOT Strategic Highway Safety Plan Steering Committee, countywide Safe Communities Coalitions, and other local safety efforts. We also conduct an annual analysis of crash trends every year for the region, and provide assistance to local agencies looking to conduct safety studies or apply for safety funding to implement safety projects. And over the last 15 years that we've had this program, we know that the needs of our communities in regard to transportation safety have really changed a lot, and our program has had to evolve to meet those needs. So that's one big reason why we launched this annual safety forum and brought you all here. We want to hear from you, specifically what your challenges and priorities are, and where we, as MorPSC staff, can provide better assistance to improve transportation safety in Central Ohio. And one other quick note, when it comes to funding for transportation safety projects, there are a few key resources available to local agencies. And MorPSC actually held a special session of our annual grant camp back in June that focused on some of those resources. So there is a handy recording available on MorPSC's YouTube page that you guys are all able to view. There was a link provided in the registration page for the safety forum, but you can also just go to MorPSC's YouTube page and search for it there. So the recording includes some quick highlights of ODOT's highway safety program and some of the changes that they're making to that funding structure this year, as well as the ODOT Transportation Alternatives Program, which has funding available for communities outside of the MPO area. And then we have our MorPSC attributable funding available for communities inside the MPO area. So the grant camp recording includes information on all three of those funding sources. So jumping into the meat of why we're all here today, I'm going to walk through a few slides here on key crash trends and patterns that we've analyzed for the region. And then if we have time remaining at the end, I'll try to answer any questions that you guys have. So feel free to use the chat as we go through the event today. So when we look at the crash data for a region, we know that the number of crashes that occur each year fluctuate slightly, but for our MPO area, we typically see around 40,000 crashes occurring on our road network each year. So you can see here how crashes remained fairly steady through 2019, starting in 2016, so over the last 5 years, before they dropped pretty significantly in 2020. And then that same sort of annual fluctuation is also pretty typical when it comes to fatal and serious injury crashes, but we've seen differing trends amongst those severe crashes over the last 5 years. So if we look at 2016 as our baseline year, we see that serious injury crashes declined slightly and held fairly steady over the last 5 years, even into 2020, but fatal crashes increased significantly starting in 2019. And then when we look at the rate of fatal and serious injury crashes compared to the total number of crashes that occurred over this time period, we see a little bit more concerning of a result. So while the total number of serious injury crashes was down in comparison to previous years, with the significant decline of overall crashes on the roadways in 2020, there was a much higher rate of serious injury with the crashes that did occur. And there are a lot of reasons why we think things played out this way as a result of the pandemic-related shutdown, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But it's also important to point out that the impacts of COVID-19 really only highlighted issues that were already occurring. Our region has seen a pretty steady rise in traffic fatalities for many years now. And as we heard from Michelle earlier, we're not alone in this. It's happening all throughout the state of Ohio. It's happening across the country. So while the total number of fatalities fluctuates every year, the rolling averages show us that the larger trend is that those traffic fatalities are consistently increasing. And as William mentioned earlier in his opening remarks, the preliminary data for this year shows that we're not trending any better. As a region, we're at the highest number of fatalities recorded year to date. So one of the major factors that we have control over that can impact the severity of crashes is roadway design. And when we look at our regional roadway network, we see that local roads make up the vast majority of our roadways. These typically have much lower traffic volumes and travel speeds, so when crashes do occur on those roads, they aren't as serious. But then we look at our arterial roads, which typically have more traffic, higher speeds, but only make up a much smaller percentage of our roadway network. And you can see here that nearly 60% of all serious injury and fatal crashes in our region occur on either minor arterial or principal arterial roadways. So when we look at roadway design for these arterial roads, we know that those roadways were designed and built really for one purpose. That's to move vehicles as efficiently as possible. And over time, that has translated into wider traffic lanes, wider roads, and even higher travel speeds. And same goes for the development. As our development patterns have changed over time, those arterial corridors are now serving all kinds of different purposes that they weren't originally designed or built for. And that's one big reason why we're seeing so many fatalities and serious injuries every day. Another aspect that has a significant impact on severity of crashes is speed. And I think most of you are familiar with the Ohio Revised Code and how speed limits are set in the state of Ohio, but many of those arterial and even our collector roadways have posted speed limits of 35 miles per hour or more, even in our most dense urban settings. So while we don't have any data available for what the actual speeds people are traveling on the roadways, the posted speed limits on those roads where crashes occur still tell an important part of that story. And the highest percentage of fatal and serious injury crashes is occurring on roadways with speed limits of 35 miles an hour. So that could be for a lot of reasons, but generally it comes back to roadway design and the multitude of functions that those roads are trying to serve all at once. And then I wanted to give a quick shout out to our partners at ODOT again for taking a serious look at how speed impacts our safety. They've made a pretty significant change to the state's speed zone evaluation process to account for things like vulnerable road users, severity of crashes, and even urban context. So they have provided local agencies with one more tool in the toolbox for improving safety. And that's something that they've just recently done. And if you're joining us for the Addressing Serious Crash Types breakout session later, you'll get to hear a little bit more about that if you haven't already. So continuing with the theme of roadway design, how we design our roadways really has a big impact on where and how crashes occur. And there are 5 specific crash types that account for around 70% of all fatalities and serious injuries. So that includes angle crashes, fixed object crashes, head-on crashes, left turn crashes, and rear end crashes. And if you join us for the breakout session on addressing serious crash types, we'll discuss these 5 crashes in more detail, including information on the types of roadways where they occur most frequently, what types of countermeasures local agencies are implementing to mitigate them, and have a little bit of discussion with all of you about what you're experiencing in your communities. And then when we think about who our roadways are designed for, we know that people walking and bicycling are typically not the priority. And while we know that many non-serious crashes involving people walking and bicycling go unreported, the crashes that are reported comprise a very small percentage of all crashes in our region, only about 2%. However, the people who are hit while walking and bicycling account for nearly 15% of all the serious injuries and more than 20% of all fatalities, with pedestrians making up the majority of those serious injuries and fatalities. And again, when we look at that larger trend year over year, we see those annual fluctuations in fatalities, but still that steady rise over the last decade. So the question remains, what do we do about this? There are several transportation safety initiatives that exist in cities and states around the country. And while the names of those initiatives differ, the efforts are basically all aligned around the same vision, eliminating deaths and serious injuries from our roadway system. They also all lean into a more proactive approach to addressing transportation safety. Our industry has traditionally approached safety issues reactively by addressing crash problems after the fatal crashes have occurred, but each of these initiatives aims to address potential safety problems before those crashes occur. So with that, I'd like to echo some of William's opening remarks. Safety really is a shared responsibility, and we need to work together, and our systems need to work together in order to get to 0 deaths on our transportation system. So achieving that vision of 0 traffic deaths requires shifting the way that we think about roadway safety and how we prioritize those investments. And I implore you all to consider how you might change your approach on upcoming projects and plans in your community. As transportation professionals, safety of the traveling public is in our hands, and know that MorPSC is here to support you in this important work. And with that, I will answer any questions that you guys have. I don't see any in the chat. So Michelle, I think I will pass things back to you.
Yep, sounds good. So this is a good time to remind everybody that as we go through the forum today, feel free to load up your questions in the chat box, and we're going to try and make some time during this session to hear from you and answer some of your important questions. So I'm really excited about today's panel. I think you're going to get a really good cross-section of local, regional, and national transportation safety perspectives. You're going to get it from both the public as well as the private sector. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce each speaker, and then we're going to have a conversation about a wide range of topics from COVID-19's impact on traffic safety, which we know was not good, all the way over to how do we make our roads safer in our communities through equity-based initiatives. So got lots of topics to cover, so we'll try and get right into it. So our first speaker is Freddie Collier. Freddie is the Director of City Planning at the City of Cleveland. He's also very involved. His planning division leads Vision Zero Cleveland along with a task force. Collier, or Freddie, was appointed by Mayor Frank G. Jackson as Director of the Cleveland City Planning Commission in 2014, becoming the first African American to serve in that capacity. With over 20 years of experience in community lending and urban planning, Director Collier works with a team of professionals that promote and implement initiatives throughout the city and the region. Director Collier began his career with the City Planning Commission in 1999 and has led several citywide initiatives, including the Connecting Cleveland 2020 citywide plan, reimagining a more sustainable Cleveland initiative, and the development of strategies to guide the dispensation of land bank parcels through the city's land bank program. In addition to serving on numerous boards and committees, Freddie has received various awards and honors, including Kaleidoscope Magazine's Under 40 Award in 2003 and a City of Cleveland Outstanding Public Service Award in 2014. So we're going to hear from Freddie this afternoon. Our second speaker, or panelist, if you will, is Beth Osborne, and Beth is Director of the Transportation for America, which is Smart Growth America's transportation arms. She was also involved in a report that we're going to talk about a little bit later called Dangerous by Design. In this position, Beth leads transportation policy development and technical assistance with departments of transportation. She was previously at the US DOT, where she served as the acting assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy, and there she helped manage the Tiger Discretionary Grant Program, the Secretary's Livability Initiative, and the development of the administration's Surface Transportation Authorizations Proposal. Before joining the DOT, Beth worked for Senator Tom Carper as an advisor for transportation trade and labor policy, as the policy director of Smart Growth America, and as legislative director for environmental policy at the Southern Governors Association. She began her career in Washington, D.C. in the House of Representatives, working as a legislative assistant for Representative Ron Klink and as a legislative director for Representative Brian Baird. Our third and final speaker today, as you can tell, we have a very distinguished group of panelists today, is Drusilla Van Hengel. She is senior principal with Nelson Nygaard. She is also involved, been working with Freddie and others on Vision Zero Cleveland. She was also involved with Dangerous by Design. She was named 2021's Private Sector Professional of the Year by the Association of Pedestrian and Bicycle Professionals. Drew has more than 25 years of academic and practical transportation planning and operations experience. Her consulting practice focuses on bicycle and pedestrian master planning and capital project development, project evaluation, healthy communities, and safe routes to schools and parks. Her academic background and public sector work in land development, traffic operations, and community planning provides a unique perspective and depth of experience that has benefited communities across the country as they decide how to take their next move toward making walking and biking viable options for people from 1 to 100. Drew's clients get built projects, implementable plans, and innovative practices. So with that, that is our panel. If we could bring up everybody's camera for the discussion, that would be great. Hi, folks. We've got I think Lauren did a really great job pulling together these questions. So let me jump right into it. So each one of you has experience working to address transportation safety at different scales and in different places. I'm going to give you a few minutes to tell us about the work you do and what you see as the biggest barriers or the greatest opportunities in transportation safety. And I'm going to start with Freddie first.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay.
We can.
So as indicated, in the city of Cleveland, particularly with the Planning Commission, we've been working very hard on making sure that we start to develop and create 21st century streets. And what does that mean? The streets of the future are going to be streets that accommodate all modes. And everyone should be safe to move about in that environment. We talk a lot here about the distribution of the right-of-way and how that distribution of access needs to be more equitable. And one of the things that we've been really focused on is really trying to promote what we call perspective transformation, getting people to change their values. I think the value proposition is key to policy change, to funding changes, and all of the things that follow, right? Because it's human beings that have to make choices and make decisions. And in this perspective transformation, there was an attitude that was pervasive that, traffic fatalities and issues are inevitable just by virtue of having so many vehicles on the road, and things are bound to happen. But part of this perspective transformation that we're promoting is that these things are preventable. And I think that is one of the reasons why we wanted to move forward with our Vision Zero initiative, is to help change the culture and change the value proposition. And the only way that that can happen is through education. People needed to be educated. So from our perspective, we started to look at really what were those things that really impacted fatalities with respect to road use. Things like inappropriate speed was key for us, impairment, distracted driving, as was alluded to earlier, things like poor visibility and weather conditions. People, don't really talk about that as much, but that's key, particularly in a city like Cleveland with our harsh winters and harsh weather. Traffic control compliance, and also traffic control devices. Insufficient separation amongst modes, having protected scenarios and things of that nature. And also inexperienced, driving. So there's an ecosystem that has impacted us negatively with respect to these issues. And the Vision Zero effort really starts to help us to frame that out, to provide the coalitions, to provide the education so that we can move forward together. Now, the other piece of that is the transaction. That's very challenging. And when I talk about the transaction, a lot of the transactions are precipitated with regarding how we get funding. And the rules, and I like to emphasize this to those people who are out there listening, the rules attached to that funding. So the rules have to change to support 21st century streets that are supportive of all modes, that allow for us to do things that the traditional engineering algorithm says may not be ideal or safe. So it's about changing that narrative. So part of this work that we're doing in Cleveland is really rethinking the street. Most recently, when we talk about COVID-19, for example, there has been a push around outdoor dining, which was a scenario that people were not ready for. And, this is an example of how the right-of-way is being disrupted in so many different ways. So I think it's going to be very incumbent on cities to be nimble and understand that the future is now. And what better way to attack the future, but with the value proposition that we want people to live and we want people to be safe moving along our streets. Thank you.
Hey, I wrote down funding follows values. Change the values and the funding will follow. That's so true. That's a good little nugget for me and everybody else in the audience. Drusilla, why don't you talk a little bit about what you see as the biggest barriers or greatest opportunities in transportation safety?
Great. Thank you. I appreciate being on this panel as well. My practice has spanned a lot of areas, from academic to public sector to advocacy and private consulting. And while I started my career studying how major urban freeways disrupt and devour local communities, today I spend most of my time trying to prevent people who are loved, who have been loved, who will be loved, from being killed or seriously injured on our city streets. And I work in this space of creating projects and programs and policies and practices to do that. And I think the greatest opportunity in my work is to kind of start to have these conversations which personalize the experience that we have as we move along the street and how we define safety. I have found over the last few years that I generally steer away from some of the concepts of the E's that are historically important but tend to other the issue. So engineering, that's your issue, not my issue. Education, that's somebody else's issue, not my issue. Start talking about information exchange and conversations that I believe are really key to integrating safety into all of our jobs and removing the boundaries that other this work to prevent the deaths of people who are or will be loved. But listen, I used to live in California where people literally say, I hope there's a crash up there if they're feeling stuck in traffic. They say that because they think if there's not a crash up there, I'm in an endless cycle of delay caused by a boundless rush hour. And I'd rather not have that experience. And we've had this tension for 50 years around delay versus safety, which goes from everywhere from the driver's point of view, which I just expressed, to the designers of our roadways, as Freddie indicated. Like, the decision-making processes are focused on delay rather than reliability and safety. So I have a lot of curiosity about how we can compel and support leaders from those designing our roads to the people who are in our capitals to be brave enough to invest in transportation options that prioritize safety and reliability over delay. And I think it's really incumbent upon us as practitioners to say we do this through ending the divorce between the risk associated with driving and the outcome that can happen if you are supported by streets where the speeds are too high. The streets are designed for the speeds to be high. So I don't know. I have a lot to say, but I'm looking forward to hearing Beth's perspective.
Well, thanks, Drew. Beth, tell us a little bit about your experience and what you see are barriers and opportunities in transportation safety.
Sure. I think there's just going to be a whole lot of agreement because I was just nodding like crazy to both what Freddie and Drusilla said. I head up a group within Smart Growth America called the Transportation and Thriving Communities group, and that's because we're looking to create those wonderful spaces where people can get to their necessities, but also to the things that make a neighborhood wonderful, no matter whether they have one car per person over 16 or not. It's the communities that allow you to run into your neighbors and and be in an active, vibrant space. Our effort, it includes organizations like Transportation for America, which is a national advocacy group. It includes the National Complete Streets Coalition, which is much more focused on TA, and where Drusilla works with us. And it includes a collaboration with the University of Wisconsin, a research group called the State Smart Transportation Initiative that rolls up their sleeves and works with state DOTs. And basically our model is to use technical assistance to those that want to do better on safety and livability and public health and climate and racial equity, to develop a list of barriers to them, to research it, report on what those barriers are and where they come from and other problems they might cause, and then develop policy and promote it to fix it, and then dig in on the implementation, find out more of what's not working, and repeat the whole process again. So we don't want to be people in DC just thinking big thoughts and disconnected from the people who do the real work. But we also want to make sure that all the 80,000 communities out there aren't having to solve this individually, that it's adding up to something that makes everybody's efforts easier to do the right thing. And the greatest opportunity that I've seen comes from the local interest to shift the way we approach transportation, to really shift transportation to support local economic development, vitality, and equity, improve safety. It was supercharged during COVID, frankly. People who don't often see their neighborhoods in the light of day saw it every single day and realized that maybe it would be nice to be able to walk to the end of their block safely. And they started rethinking and recasting the way their community should look and feel to them. But also innovation and experimentation was supercharged. Rather than spending 5 years thinking about whether or not it might be okay to put some bikes on the side of the road or maybe a place to sit next to a restaurant, we went out and tried things and then got feedback, which I think is a huge opportunity. I think one of the least fair things we do on built environment issues is go into public meetings and expect people to look at a sketch on a piece of paper, close their eyes, create a virtual reality environment, walk through it, and give feedback. That's not how humans work. But if we can try things temporarily with the promise that if you hate it, it is gone. Things that are easily changeable, and let them interact and say, this is what I like, this is what I don't, or this isn't going to work, or this isn't big enough. They're going to be able to have a much bigger impact, and we're going to get real responses. That is a huge opportunity. I fear that experimentation will go away as we move past COVID, and I think that would be sloppy and frankly just flat out stupid. This was a great thing for people to try things out and experiment. The biggest barrier, like I said, maintaining that spirit of experimentation. But the fact that safety is not an add-on, that complete streets and Vision Zero is not, it's not dressing up what we already do. We have to admit that what we do now does not work. It does not move cars quickly, even though we've designed it to do only that. It fails miserably at that. The more we try to do it, the slower people move in their cars. But we don't want to learn. We just want to keep doing the same thing. And in doing that, we create danger unnecessarily. And we have got to recognize that where there is development, all vehicles must move slowly, or we just admit that saving people theoretical seconds is more important than human life. And there is no in between on that. It is as simple as that. And right now we seem to want to build highways through neighborhoods and add a 3-foot bike lane on the side and call that safety. That is not safety. That is whitewashing. And so I think putting real meaning to Vision Zero, complete streets, and safety, and recognizing we will take space from cars is a big barrier, rather than it just being a nice little amenity on top of our highway system.
Thanks, Beth. I like that maintain an attitude of experimentation. I hope we don't lose that either. I think it's important. Let's stick on COVID for a second. So clearly COVID-19 has had an impact on health, the economy, but we also know it impacted transportation safety as well. So for those who haven't seen the statistics, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration says that last year VMT decreased, vehicle miles traveled decreased by about 13%, yet traffic deaths increased by 7%, which is consistent with what we saw here in Ohio. Traffic deaths rose even higher, 23% for Black Americans. And these trends seem to be getting worse every year. So this is a two-part question. I'm going to start with Drew, please. How can we reverse this trend? And how do we help populations that are most in need?
I wonder, I appreciate you starting with me, Michelle, but I wonder if we can offer Freddie the opportunity to speak first as a Black American.
Let's do it, Freddie.
Up to you, Freddie, if you prefer to.
No, I actually appreciate the opportunity to respond to that question. And, I'll start from the, sort of equity, perspective. When we look at the most dependent and most vulnerable populations, they're the most exposed. If you look at many communities in our city, and you look at street conditions in communities where you have a large portion of individuals who do not own cars, who are concentrated in very dense land use scenarios, who have major thoroughfares going through their neighborhood where people are not stopping to transact and do business. They're going through the community to get to a destination outside that community. So what that leaves is individuals in that neighborhood exposed, with people going through their community at high speeds, basic traffic conditions not being ideal. I'm talking about crosswalks, time traffic signals, all the fundamentals that it shouldn't even be a conversation. It's just how things should be, right? And when you have that type of scenario, that becomes a problem. And I think that's in part why you see that disparity, between those types of road users in those communities or in minority and impoverished communities. Right. These things are systemic. Right. This is not new, and when we talk about it being systemic, it's that legacy of policies that have advantaged some and disadvantaged others. So it goes back to that whole value proposition. Who are we, as leaders and as community members when we don't care about the least of people, right? And then, many will argue, and I would argue that, race and structural racism is a part of that policy decision-making. The other component, I think is, important when we talk about COVID-19 and what COVID-19 has exposed to the world with respect to these disparities and inequities. I think it's two-part with respect to COVID-19. One, people were locked up for a year. We were all in prison in our own way. And when people got back in their vehicles, they drove like bats out of hell. And I'm sure that has been the case all over the country, where, people just were not responsible, not paying attention, and just felt this desire to just be free. And I think there were some unintended negative externalities as a result of that. I think that was a contributor. Also, when you look at, individuals who have to, walk, ride buses, people that are in wheelchairs, you look at the design of the streets in many of our neighborhoods. And I know in Cleveland, we began to map out, and Drew knows this very well, our high injury networks. And when you look at them, they are major corridors going through many of our lower income neighborhoods in the near West Side and near East Side. And that's home to a lot of our minority, Latinx and African-American populations. So this shouldn't be a surprise when you understand it from a legacy point of view. How do we address it? Obviously, going back to the term I used before, that there's an ecosystem of issues that we have to attack this from. And I think a comprehensive approach to it, which is what Vision Zero begins to do, is what cities need. And if that is proper resourced, and I will emphasize this, with the proper leadership, that is so important, okay? Because it takes leadership to be able to move the establishment in a different direction, given, where we've been and what the rules have been, whether it's the Federal Highway Administration and things that were enacted that created some of these legacy issues, and all of those things, right? So I think that we are at a good time, and I can't help. And Beth, good to see you. I was on the panel with you some years ago, and you inspired me so much. When I first took this job, we were on a panel together. You may or may not remember, but just wanted to give you a shout out that I really enjoyed our dialogue. But one thing that we have to make sure that we do is we are in a unique time, and we have to take advantage of the moment that we have right now, because it's a small window that's going to allow us to either go in the right direction or the wrong direction very quickly. So I think this is why it's so important, with all the resources that are being thrown around from the federal government through the American Jobs Program and the beefing up of a lot of these infrastructure dollars that are flowing to cities. This is the time. And again, it's a short window.
Thanks, Freddie. Drew, you want to address the issue of how do we reverse this increasing trend with fatalities and how we help populations in with the most need?
I'll try. Thank you. I'll try not to duplicate too much of what Freddie acknowledged and brought to this conversation. I think there are some other trends that we can elevate. One, and Freddie talked about people driving through Black and Brown communities and communities of people living in poverty to get to other places. It's also true that we have created a complex land use and investment patterns, which makes those streets most accessible to people who are living in poverty and are people of colors. Our arterials and principal arterials, they are poorly connected. There are few alternatives to getting from the places where we live, worship, love, recreate to the other places that we need to get to without interacting with those streets. And so people living in communities around these arterials, which are proven, as Lauren showed, to be the most deadly, have no alternatives and alternative networks to get them walking and biking into transit safely. And so in terms of like being no surprise, here are some more factors to like put into the complex equation of why this is happening. One, people are living closer to these streets and don't have alternatives to them. Mm-hmm. There's been traffic declines in traffic volumes, which perhaps are just enough to facilitate speeds increasing. There's some math around this. You bring the volumes down just a bit and people are comfortable traveling at higher speeds with closer following distances. People who are walking or biking are exposed to these lower volumes and higher speeds, and so the fatal outcomes are higher. Also, the people are exposed to these people living in poverty and people of color are represented in the essential workers that have been traveling to work during the pandemic, while people like me are living at work with my dog and already not being exposed to these streets because I live in a place where it's not essential for me to travel an arterial, but also that we're just not going out. And so the rates it shouldn't be surprising us that this is happening. There's more exposure in so many ways. And so with respect to the investments which might help to reverse these trends that we're seeing. Some of the ones I see are transit stop connections so that people can confidently board and depart from buses. It should not be enough to be able to get on the bus to go to the places you're going, but it should also be necessary to be able to get home from the stop across the street to at the end of your journeys. I think another key investment is to think about prioritizing where the need is greatest, where the highest concentration of low-income people live, where the highest concentration of people of color live, and restructuring the capital investment program process so that is a key and defined metric for investment. And then investing first not in vehicle improvements that, in theory, as Beth said, reduce delay and reduce travel times, but investing first in walking connections and crossings. We need to start with where our feet are.
That's good feedback. Beth, what do you think? What do you have to say on this issue? How do we help communities in need? How do we reverse this trend?
I do want to point out that the preliminary numbers for 2021 are worse than 2020.
Indeed, they are.
So as we saw in 2020, traffic loads went down, speeds went through the roof. And I don't mean speeding. I want to be very clear. When we talk about speeds, most people think people are violating the speed limit. I'm talking about people going the speed limit, and in most cases, the speed limits are set inappropriately high. My friend and colleague Chuck Marone with Strong Towns talks about how where there's development, speeds should be low, and we're talking under 25-20 miles per hour. And where you create a real throughway, there should be no development, and speed should be above 50. And if you're between 25 and 50, you are, I love his comparison to it being a futon. It is something trying to be two things at once that stinks at both of them. Basically, if you're traveling on a roadway that is marked at 35 or 40 miles per hour, it is set up to fail at being both a local street and a throughway. And that's what our standard is. So our standard is a failure. And it creates conflict at high speed. And the reason that is a problem is when you're moving at speed, and in this case, I might be talking about a simple 35 miles per hour, is your field of vision is smaller. Your ability to react is, you have to react faster, and your ability to stop and avoid a conflict is less. And then if you hit someone, it's more likely to be injurious or fatal. So when we saw traffic loads go down, we saw speeds go up, which meant mistakes were more costly and deadly. The reason lower traffic loads lead to higher crashes and fatalities is because our roads are built to tell people to go fast. And our greatest safety intervention right now is traffic congestion, which is, I would argue, our only priority in transportation is to remove that traffic congestion, which means our only priority in transportation is to get rid of the single thing most likely to prevent fatalities right now, because we refuse to design roadways for safety. We design it to make people feel like the inconvenient way we've laid out their community is convenient by letting them drive quickly between them. Of course, that just creates traffic congestion, so it fails too, but it's set up for danger. And of course, the danger is going to fall heaviest on those who have the least access to a personal automobile, and those are going to be people of color and low-income people. And that, the fact that that is not predicted shows how poor our approach to transportation is, because it's beyond predictable, it's obvious.
As a follow-up question to that, I mean, do you see some states or communities that are doing a better job in designing and controlling for speeds? And, you know, retrofitting our roads is a very difficult thing to do. Is someone doing it right?
Retrofitting our roads is not a difficult thing to do at all. It's just something we don't want. So we call it difficult because we don't feel like it. The fact of the matter is we do interventions in cities with paint. We work with cities in a cohort fashion and we'll give them, you know, $20,000, which they'll match, and they'll go and use paint and maybe some delineators or some planters or some, you know, but really it's mostly just pretty paint, and they change people's behavior like that. Mm-hmm. It is such, we know what to do. It is such low-hanging fruit. The fact that we are not doing it, we could not scream any louder how little we care about this. But again, that experimentation, and that's what we're trying to foster when we do these cohorts, is to show people what small interventions will change behavior. There's been some really interesting studies that have come out in recent years that show how attuned human beings are to design. And to the extent where if they see buildings set back from the roads and wide, straight roadways, they will automatically intuit that this is a highway, and they will drive like they're on a highway because that's what the design is screaming at them to do. People aren't making continuous high-level decisions as they drive, because if you did, when you got where you were going, you'd need a nap, you'd be exhausted. They're taking in the cues from the design. And what we've learned is if the design says this is a highway, something called inattentive blindness occurs, which means you will see a pedestrian, but it won't register because a pedestrian shouldn't be on a highway. And that creates danger. So it's interesting. We know that we have to change the design for high-speed travel. That was the whole concept behind the interstate system. We knew it had to be a different kind of roadway. But the engineering community refuses to believe that design can actually impact the opposite and create safer behavior. They know it must be there to facilitate higher speed behavior, but they will not deploy and employ design to create an obvious safer pattern of behavior. And what's also very interesting is when you slow down the traffic, you don't need stop signs as much. You don't need traffic lights as much. And slow and steady often wins the race. You will likely get through that corridor faster with no lights and slower travel than with high-speed travel having to stop all the time. So it's weird. Everything we're doing, it doesn't accomplish what it's supposed to, and it generates damage. So I think, you know, going out and helping people experiment and try things and prove to themselves how easy it is to do is a big key to getting them there.
Did you want to add something, Freddie?
Yeah, I do want to say this, and I definitely agree with Beth and everything that she said, and it goes back to that, you know, attitude and that whole leadership piece. But one thing that we, you know, talk about here, when this came up in one of our Vision Zero breakouts, you know, the car is like the boogeyman, right? Because it's really the culprit, and it's the most hefty and most dominant, you know, device in the roadway. So naturally, it's going to have that type of thought processes behind it. But one thing that, you know, I do want to send out to sort of the automobile industry, that they have a role to play with respect to helping our right-of-ways be safer. You know, the technology and innovation that's happening with automobiles, more compact vehicles. I know that in Arizona, they're testing single occupancy vehicles, you know, that's less heft, you know, in the roadway. A lot of the vehicles nowadays, the technology that they have, the sensors that are in the cars that can detect the proximity of a pedestrian. So I think every road user, that includes the automobile industry, has to take this seriously with respect to what they're putting on the street, the type of product they're putting out there, and making vehicles even safer. You know, I know we, you know, talk about it from the perspective of, you know, the vehicle being the bad thing. And in many cases, it is, no question about it. So rather than always preaching to the choir, we have to go where the problem exists. And I think the automobile industry can do better with helping to mitigate some of these issues by how it designs its vehicles and the innovations associated with its products using technology.
Got it. Thank you, Freddie.
And
Hey,
Michelle,
oh yeah,
I'm sorry.
that's okay.
I just have to, I just also would like to pile on because I think I agree with 99% of what's been said about this question already, but I do take a little exception to othering the engineering community. I think it's super important to understand that there are some historic guidance and standards which are inappropriate, especially for the newer engineers who are like torn between applicability to AASHTO standards, as an example, versus the application of their engineering judgment in making decisions. And I don't think they refuse to believe that design can create an obvious safer pattern of behavior, but rather they are constrained to exercise their engineering judgment in a way that can have that outcome. And so I would look to say, like, I think we need to support impressive standards that engineers can lean into, especially the newer ones who might be more willing to think in this way, but feel confused about how to like be practicing their discipline correctly, and also leaning into experiments. I have many engineering colleagues across the country who are leaning into these experiments, these tactical installations, which can be deployed and undeployed instantly, but we also need to support them in having more metrics than the number of complaints that they receive from people who are used to traveling swiftly and undisturbed along the travelways, and such as like safety, prioritizing safety as the key metric. What is the potential safety outcome of this intervention? And acknowledging that measuring collisions is not the only way to assess safety. We need to measure upstream to unsafe speed, any people's confidence or comfort in using the facilities. So I needed to just kind of lean into that statement around the engineering, the othering of engineers in this equation.
And you are right. I'm using the community as a general amorphous boogeyman blob, and it actually comes out of conversations with the engineers who don't feel like they have any capacity to change that system. We've created working groups and gone into state DOTs in several states, more than a dozen. And in every case, the terminology I used was used by the engineers within the department. They feel like they're fighting an engineering community and status quo that is unmovable. And so I'm referring to that system. There are tons of engineers that would love to do something different, but they will tell you they will be punished for doing so. They will be held responsible for being over budget and over or outside their schedule because they tried to do something different, because they tried to exercise judgment. And many of them will tell you that exercising judgment means making things up over and over, and they don't want to make things up. They want guidance. So it is like I said, a amorphous bad guy that I'm referring to. Systematic bad guy, no one human being.
Right. I think there are a lot of engineers in the audience who will appreciate that perspective. So thank you for adding in there, Drew and Beth. So just a reminder, we've only got 20 minutes left in the forum. If you have questions, go ahead and load them in the chat box. I'll try and keep an eye on it. But let's take a turn on Vision Zero and related efforts. So there have been lots of traffic safety efforts launched in the past decade. There's Vision Zero, there's Towards Zero deaths, there's Safe System, but they all have the same goal of preventing deaths or serious injuries. Many of these initiatives acknowledge that human error is inevitable, but the transportation community has a responsibility to design our roadways and our systems so that we can reduce fatalities or eliminate fatalities and serious injuries. So it's not just on human error anymore, it's on us as well to change that. So let's talk a bit about what key elements of these different initiatives do you think have the most potential to reduce serious crashes? And let's start with Freddie.
Wow, that's a great question. And it's hard to pick one because all of them are, I think, so important, and you have to address them all. But if it was up to me from a planning and development perspective, it's definitely street design. I think is the big one, because I believe that as human beings, we're creatures of habit, and everyone adapts. And I think one of the biggest challenges that a lot of elected officials and other policymakers have is the moment somebody complains, they acquiesce. You know, it's never a education or a lead. It's more of a response. And as long as you are in a response mode and somebody complains, you'll never move the needle. You know, so I think in part people learn to behave a certain way, and we're like water. We flow to where, you know, the crevice is. You know, even if we do it kicking and screaming, you know, and that's okay. And you know, leadership has to be comfortable with that. You know, because it's just, again, the growing pain of transitioning into something that makes more sense. So, you know, for me, I think it's the street design component, and then probably the lowest hanging fruit, but in our state has, you know, it has been a challenge. I can't wrap my head around why, is speed limits. You know, obviously though, with speed limits, you know, even if you reduce the, you know, sign, there's the adherence to that, you know, and for some people, you know, signage is not enough. You know, it's like, you know, 25 miles an hour, but if my road is designed like a freeway, I'm not doing 25 miles. I'm doing 30 if I can get 40 if I can get away with it. So these are the types of things that, you know, we have to focus on. But I think it's a coupling of things, you know. But if I had to pick one, since you asked the question, I would say that the big one is how we design our streets, because that's the predictor of how we whip our society into behaving a certain way.
Beth, what do you think? What's the most critical?
I definitely think design, because we spent so much energy on enforcement and education. And just like Freddie said, like, it is amazing to me that we're going to send every human signal possible to you to go fast, post an inappropriate low speed limit for the design, and then enforce it against you. That's trickery. That's really bad governance. And we're going to educate you to behave in a different way than would be appropriate based on our design doesn't make a whole lot of sense either. So, you know, moving towards making it easy for people to behave in the way we want them to behave, rather than hard and against all of their better judgment and all the signs they get. And I think digging into the implementation and procedure within agencies is a really important area. Drew just mentioned it as well. You know, there's so many systems that go against creating the right design. So, you know, when you start to design a street, the first thing you've got to identify is the speed expected, the vehicle speed. Well, that tells you a lot right there about our priorities. There's only one user in that system. So first vehicle speed, then vehicle volume, then safety, which means, well, drivers will make mistakes. How do we make space for them to make mistakes, like to be able to run off the road onto the sidewalk, for example, the nuclear zone where the pedestrians are. And then we're going to set a budget. And after the budget is set, then we're going to think about runoff and pedestrian safety and bicycle infrastructure. I mean, that speaks volumes about where those things fit in our priorities. And from the engineer's perspective, if they have to set the budget before they consider those things, what are they going to do except bust the budget? We have designed it in a way that it can't help but bust the budget, which says we don't want to do them. So if we want a different product, we have to give different tools to the people whose job it is to create the product. And a lot of what we do in our analysis of complete streets policies is we evaluate exactly this style of implementation. Who's going to be in charge of looking at the procedures and updating them to meet with a Vision Zero complete streets type of approach? What are the deadlines? You know, what are the feedback loops? And not just make a great statement of policy, but really think about where there is a division between the policy statements and the actual tools and procedures that we put in the hands of the people whose job it is to deliver the results.
Drew, a little side note before you answer the question. People want to know how you keep your dog so quiet throughout this meeting. I do too.
He's just great at work.
That dog, you should be paying her. I hope she gets a good milk bone.
COVID puppy. I can't leave him alone at in the house, however. So
gotcha. Well,
tune back in later for that.
What do you think? What's the most critical element of Vision Zero, TZD, safe systems? What should we be focusing on to be successful?
The other answers were so great. So I'll try not to repeat them, but I will say there's no one thing. And what I really like to communicate is this kind of Swiss cheese approach, which is a safe systems approach that says if there's a safety net. So if any one person who's contributing to safety has made a mistake, it doesn't result in the outcome being death or lifelong serious injury. And so with that in mind, if we think about that safety net and all the players and disciplines that are responsible for affecting that safety net, I would propose, and I haven't yet gotten a city to propose that they would adopt this, but we relook at the ways we are evaluated in the work that we do. If my job says that I am going to be measured by my success in preventing future deaths by slowing speeds, having more effective safety design, a safety-focused design, I think I'm going to change the way that I do my work. And I challenge our agencies to say, let's incorporate this into a way where people know that they are contributing to this very important outcome, and it's measured in some way by the way that they are evaluated. It's not very popular, but I feel like it's something to be explored.
Thanks, Drew. Let me see if I can kind of summarize what Ira's saying here today. So this is from the chat box. He wants to know, how do we incorporate what we're discussing here today to where the rubber meets the road? And he was referring to the attributable funding committee policies. So how do we translate what we're doing today into funding that prioritizes safety for all road users? You got some advice for people in the audience? Let's start with Freddie.
I think and just based on our local experience here, the verdict is still out on that, because I think we're still maturing in that vein. I think your regional MPO is key, because that is where the resources come through from the federal government in large part. And if you have a very competent and equitable minded MPO, I think that they can shape programs that, and I hate to use the term force, but I'll use the term guide cities in the direction of doing projects that make sense for 21st century street development. And I think as local municipalities apply for these resources and the proper requirements are attached to that, it forces the municipalities to perform a certain way. And I think that's part of the culture change that I think is happening. Now, here's the other component with respect to local municipalities. And this goes back to education. When we think about education, we're often talking about educating the community, educating road users. You have to educate the people in the system, because maintenance is also something that is nightmarish for cities with respect to having a diversity of road product out there in different scenarios, because all streets won't be the same in the future, right? So streets will vary, and the cost of maintenance associated that will vary. So we not only have to put up the resources to be able to create these street products on the front end, we have to think about the education and long-term maintenance and the capacity to do so, particularly in cities in the Midwest where you have inclement weather. These are real issues. We get a bad rap, I think, in the public sector of not being progressive because we have to do components of things, because we know that we can't responsibly do something that's progressive and it looks like crap, or if it's falling apart or creates a problem 5 years down the road. That's irresponsible. So we need to have the resources both on the front end and the back end to be able to implement and maintain long term.
Okay, follow up, Drew. How do we shift? What can we do coming out of this meeting to help get more resources, more funding for all road users.
Yeah, that's great. I agree 100% with what Freddie indicated. And I think our elected officials need support, and that is our board, people who are elected to our boards, people who are elected to our governance. There is a lot of fear in making decisions from my experience. I've seen a lot of fear in making decisions, which stems, which reflects itself in a different way, for a variety of ways, depending upon where we are in staff in these agencies or organizations. But at the end of the day, our elected officials need to feel confident that when they invest in safety, that they're not going to lose their constituency. And so what can we do in our systems to reassure them that this is the right choice and you won't lose your job because of it?
It's a good one. Beth?
I just want to second what Drew just said. The people that don't want change will always show up and yell. If you want change, you have to show up and speak very loudly too. And you need to do it every time. And I know that's exhausting, but you can't just leave the people who are doing the good work to take all the slings and arrows themselves. You've got to show up at these public meetings. You've got to send letters. You've got to, really be on top of it. But we don't need money to do this. We just need to stop spending our money to undermine this. Every single project in an area with development should be built to slow down traffic and to allow people outside of cars to move around without dying. That I have to say it is bizarrely frustrating how hard it is to make a case against a system that literally generates traffic, increases fatalities and emissions, lowers public health outcomes, and costs people and taxpayers a ton of money. And part of it is, frankly, the transportation agencies lie to the public. They say if they add a lane, it will fix congestion. That's not true. It's never been true. We don't measure induced demand. We don't measure things that would prove that this project is slated to fail. We say that we can build for fast-moving traffic and it can be done safely. That is a lie. If we start actually telling people the truth, people will gravitate towards things that are a better expenditure of dollars. And there are really exciting opportunities to do this that are already being employed by some transportation agencies around the country. For example, in our smartphones, we have things like Google Maps that tells us I can go in and type in restaurants and I can find every restaurant in my area and directions to every single one to figure out which I can get to the fastest. That technology could be deployed to measure the effectiveness of our transportation system very cheaply. We just don't, because we are comfortable and used to the systems that we built up in the 1950s. Those are the ones that only measure vehicle speed. It leaves people out. It doesn't consider the interaction between land use and transportation. And it really doesn't measure the things that Drew and Freddie were talking about. We can do that now. And it opens up a huge world to us about how the system is and isn't working and the many ways we could intervene to improve the outcomes. So I think that is a really exciting area. Virginia wanted to do this years ago, almost 10 years ago now, didn't know how to do it and figured it out for the rest of us. So let's go just take advantage and draft off of them. And let's recognize, so the money that's coming down from the feds in the infrastructure bill is very status quo. I would argue that for locals who want to use their money differently, they should be looking for ways to measure projects that they may not be controlling according to their priorities and holding their states responsible for those outcomes. And then secondly, the reconciliation bill does have money that would go directly to locals for the first time for transportation projects, very much targeted towards them. That money is at risk, so pay attention if that's something you all find interesting. And like I said, there are great tools available to us now to measure what we mean for the first time, and we should really start doing that.
Freddie, did you raise your hand?
Yeah. One thing I want to add, Beth inspired me. I was going to get in trouble for saying this, but I'm going to say it. The federal government, okay? And I think in this day and age, to a degree, they've been getting a pass. And here's what I mean by that. When you think about the federal highway system and when it was established, that was a federal concerted effort where the government got dirty and really was a part of implementation. It wasn't just this make it rain sort of deal while they sit back and say, cities, you figure it out. And by the way, you got 10 minutes to spend this, or are you sending it back? Because that's really what's going on in many respects. So the question becomes, we need a federal concerted effort, a partnership with federal, state, and local government, with everyone getting dirty with respect to addressing infrastructure throughout our nation, period. And it has to be aggressive as it was when the federal highway system was being established. It has to be at that level in order to change things at the pace in which we all desire. And I think until you get that, you're going to have the advocacy, the wins, you know, the best practices, and that maturation will be a lot slower.
Okay. We have 2 minutes left. Drew, I'll give you the last word since Beth and Freddie have spoken. Do you want to add anything, something that we didn't cover?
Yeah, I guess. I'm thinking about how we, thank you for that. I'm thinking about how we personalize these conversations to affect some of these amazing ideas we've heard today. And before this session, I just listened to LaTanya Bird's personal story about the details of losing her niece Samara and her sons on Roosevelt Boulevard in Pennsylvania. And this was put forward through Smart Growth America's Dangerous by Design work. And Families for Safe Streets is doing incredible work, inviting people to share the life and death of not only their loved ones, but who were killed or seriously injured, but also talk about how these the parties involved in the crashes are changed forever. And I think we need to have these conversations. We need to support these conversations and the people who are willing to share their lived experience with us, so that we can build an underlying base towards a cultural shift which says, no, it's not acceptable. If this were my family, I would not accept this. And I just implore people who have not yet been, thinking about the lived experiences of the people who are involved and affected by crashes to share those stories with the people who you know and love and ask them to get involved.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to thank you all today for joining us for this forum. I thought it was a great conversation. I learned a lot. We got some different perspectives from the national all the way down to our sister city, Cleveland regions, Northeast Ohio region. So I learned a lot. I've enjoyed the conversation. I hope everyone on the call has too. If you have any follow-up questions, I'm sure Lauren would be happy to facilitate those offline. I saw 1 or 2 in the chat box. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my friend and colleague Kirsten Carr, who I believe is going to guide us into the next part of our MorPSC session here today. So thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. And I don't want this to stop. This was such an excellent conversation. I thought we should all applaud you. I know we can't really do it well, but just know virtually behind closed microphones and cameras, people are doing that. Thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us today and share your thoughts and perspectives. I think Michelle put it really well early on. There's so many good nuggets and there's so much wisdom here that I know we can all take away from you. My name is Kirsten Carr. I'm MorPSC's Director of Planning and Sustainability. I actually started off at MorPSC as their safety planner, developing the region's first comprehensive safety plan alongside Michelle and her incredible team. So we go way back and started this whole program about 15 years ago. I'm aging myself right now. At that time, we only had a 60% accuracy rate of crash reports. And so our main focus initially was really just to educate our law enforcement community on the importance of crash data and to really help them with process and technology solutions so their jobs would be easier when they're recording information out in the field and along a busy roadway, because they're risking their lives often as well as they're reporting to a crash and trying to to help them. And we've gained a lot of incredible partners along the way in those few years, all of you on this Teams call today, and really every team member that we've gained since then. And I think, Michelle, I can speak both for MorPSC and ODOT, has brought incredible passion to their job. You saw that with Lauren Cardoni, one of my team members earlier, who kicked us off. And they really helped us with innovative thinking to become better at analyzing, at educating, at enforcing, and also the storytelling that's so important. And then with Complete Streets and other policy and transportation changes that we've implemented here locally, we're definitely trying to make strides in roadways engineering, but as you all pointed out, it's really, really slow. There's so much work to do. And I couldn't agree with all of you more with how much we've historically designed our streets with the main focus on getting cars through quickly. And then we're complaining about drivers speeding and crashing. And someone who grew up in Germany and in Europe, I have a very strong perspective on a non-multimodal transportation system here versus in Germany, where I never owned a car until I was 27 and moved here because I had to buy one here. And Freddie, you said it earlier, and I think all of you too, we really need a culture change, and change is so difficult and sometimes really painfully slow. But I'm hoping that this conversation really inspires our engineers and planners who are very passionate about making a difference to work harder and stronger and really pushing the right policies and programs and engineering mechanics forward. And one tough nut that still remains is really drivers' behavior. Like, we can engineer the heck out of it, but if we're still having people driving drunk or being on their phones and being distracted, it's really difficult to address that. But with that, I really hope that everyone enjoyed the panel as much as I am and feels inspired. Please know that the work you do for our region and the state is truly appreciated, and your commitment as well. And so hopefully we can start changing the curve towards getting to zero traffic fatalities here. I know it's possible, but we all need to get in this together.